So, practically speaking, what are churches doing in response to the changes that you've seen in the UK?
The churches are trying to work through actually what the law is and is going to be. This is one of the huge kind of grey areas that people don't quite know how far-reaching some of the impacts are. We've got patterns of complaint, obviously, as is starting to happen here in Australia, for instance, on the Central Coast. But actually with us that's kind of slightly further developed. So there are kind of three main areas where, certainly in terms of children and young people, where we've got real concerns. One would be the youth worker from the local church who's got an in to particular schools, say for a lunchtime club or something like that. Again, the problem is, how does a school allow someone to question same-sex marriage? Or whatever it happens to be, actually. Very easy at that point for the school to say, we don't want the trouble, we don't want the questions, so we'll shut that down. The other area, when you're thinking about quite how extensive the impact is on state education, you think, well, why don't we set up Christian schools? The trouble is with that, there are various ways in which you need recognition by the government agency Ofsted, the Office for Education, Standards in Education. They've started asking questions of faith schools precisely in the same-sex area, where they're expecting politically correct answers. So again, you've got the question of regulation there, and if you're not coming up with a politically correct answer, you effectively lose your license to operate. That's the final threat. And there's evidence that actually is starting to happen, not just with Christian schools, Jewish schools and Muslim schools as well. Then you say, well, okay, so we don't want to have our children in state education, we don't want to have our children in faith schools because they're being closed down. What do? You homeschool them, or you send them to Sunday school or whatever. The trouble is, at that point, an out-of-school setting, one of the government's most recent proposals is, let's regulate out-of-school settings. And when people have protested about this and said this is ludicrous, you're saying it's to do with the prevention of terrorism and so on, the reaction is, yes, it's true that it's broadly framed, but it's not aimed at you. And at that point, when you have a politician saying, yeah, trust me, given the record of the British government that actually introduced same-sex marriage over the back of broken promises that they wouldn't, you're thinking, this trust stuff, actually you need to establish a record.
So you spoke about Jewish schools, Muslim schools being affected as well.
Oh yeah.
Is the church, are churches actively working alongside, Jewish leaders, Muslim leaders to, I guess, protest against these laws, to actually seek changes? Are you actually seeing, an ecumenicalism there, or at least a working together to push back against these things?
I'd say that there's a co-belligerence there, and there's a co-belligerence that actually goes wider than just the schools. So certainly some of the secular civil liberties organisations are recognising that the direction of travel is deeply problematic. Over freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and that in a sense is quite a good thing, because it does mean that in all conscience you can cooperate with people on this particular issue, and not just be written off as, oh well, that's just special pleading on behalf of Christians. There is something kind of profoundly important here about whether as Christians we are committed to freedom of expression. And personally I think we have to be. And the reason why I think we have to be is that once I start policing in the kind of way that I see the UK government starting to do, then I think actually in effect I'm playing God. And we can't do that.
So then, practical advice then for the pastor. You spoke about it being primarily a pastoral problem. How does the pastor face, I guess, being labelled a homophobe and a bigot what's your advice to the church planter there?
For the church planter, I'd say don't be on your own. That's kind of a weird thing to say to a church planter, I appreciate. But to make sure you've got a network of friends, people you can play ideas off, because of course it's possible that we can, from time to time, say what the Bible teaches and actually be closetly homophobic ourselves. So actually, you want to make sure with friends who are going to challenge you and so on, that you're not, but friends who will also say, yeah, stick with it, brother, stick with it, sister, because this actually is what the Bible teaches. So I'd say network is hugely important there. Mm-hmm. Depending on how far one's got with a church plant, actually making sure that a leadership group really is aware of the issues and the risks, and to look the risks in the eye and say, it's worth running these risks for Jesus' sake. Mm. Of course there are risks in church planting. One risk, of course, is that we go bust. That happens from time to time. Wish it didn't, but it does.
And one of those major risks is actually not having access to the school buildings.
That's right.
Of which many church plants need to meet in because they don't have a building.
Yeah, that's right. So making sure that the leadership group is on board, and then making sure that one has contingency plans in place. And therefore not being taken by surprise by the fact that this is one of the areas at the moment where the world's going to push us. It'll push us in other areas. So if you set up a Christian school, it's going to push you on whether or not you're teaching that miracles happen, or that there's creation rather than simply evolution and nothing else. It's simply recognising this is a risk. If this risk happens, then this is what I'm going to do. Working out in advance what the policy is when that same-sex couple does come through the door. Not how you're going to exclude them, but how you're going to care for them. Mm. That's the thing. So, are you, for instance, going to say, "I've got the address of someone who deals sensitively in change therapy," that kind of thing, or are you going to say, "No, that's not what we're going to do. We're going to care using alternative strategies. But what we're not going to do is cave in." And that would be the kind of final thing that I'd say. Be so rooted in the Scriptures that you know what the Scriptures say about this issue, but also be so rooted in the Scriptures that you know that Jesus is Lord even of these situations.
Finally, some of the pushback has come through people actually trawling through the websites of churches and actually finding sermons on this issue. What would your counsel be to a church planter? Should they preach on this topic? And then should they put them up publicly on their website?
That's a really good question, and I think it's going to depend an awful lot on particular situations. I think my basic thought is, at the moment, you've got to teach on this topic. You must teach on it. If you're meeting in a school and you know that your position in the school is fragile and the school won't back you, then I think, of course, there's a case for not having it publicly accessible. On the other hand, if you've got a really good relationship with the school, it's robust, and you know they're not going to shaft you, then put it up. And at that point, I'd say that's a real incentive to make sure that relationships with, say, the school or the other institution where you're meeting actually really, really does work. I'd also say, in any event, work out an alternative venue as far as you can. And I know that's a kind of counsel of perfection, but yeah, experience in the UK on too many issues, not simply this one, is actually it's wonderful to have access to schools. That's absolutely great, but we can't count on it. And in particular, too many places I think have been shafted over the last 10 years precisely because someone's got at the school. So at that point, having a plan B, and if necessary, saying, yeah, we're going to meet in house groups for an awful lot of the time, and when we get together, we are going to meet in a pub, if that's what it takes, or we're going to hire a function room for a party. Our party will be celebrating the Lord's Supper, and that will be where all of our cell groups get together, something like that. So we are going to have to think inventively about this. And yeah, of course, what I'm saying at that point is that church planting, because of the different situations that people have, the organisation of a particular group of the people of God is going to take various forms. And sometimes it's going to look very much like a network of cell groups, I think. But not always. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. So the fact that your church plant doesn't look the same as everybody else's church plant, there may be good reason for that. There may be bad reason, but there may be very good reason for it, because you're working in a town and in a situation where the council of the town and the people in the schools actually, on this or on another issue, are so hostile that you have to evolve an alternative strategy. But I think, myself, that's what church planting's about.
It's being nimble enough to be able to deal with what is in front of you.
Nimble's a good word, adaptable.